Ever feel like just keeping up with logistics is a full-time job?
Oh, tell me about it.
I mean, between the global supply chains and like uh, constantly changing regulations, it's a lot to stay on top of.
It really is.
That's why we're checking out a tool that claims to do just that, keep you in the loop.
Yeah.
It's called This Week in Freight.
Okay.
It's a brand new segment from the Let's Talk Logistics podcast.
Let's talk logistics. Yeah.
Exactly. A favorite for folks in the industry covering, everything from supply chains to transportation, adding This Week in Freight to the mix.
Oh, wow.
And it's going to be super valuable, I think, for anyone who needs to stay updated on all the latest developments.
Oh, for sure. We've got some really fascinating stuff to get into today.
Yeah, should be pretty interesting.
So we've got 3 different sources that we're going to be kind of jumping between.
Mm-hmm.
All very different, but also as we get into it, you'll see some kind of surprising connections between them.
Definitely.
So the first one, we've got the FDA, and they just did something pretty groundbreaking, right? They just, for the first time ever, authorized the marketing of these ZYN nicotine pouches.
Yeah, this is a big one. First time they've ever authorized the nicotine pouch product.
And I mean, they're not saying that these pouches are, quote unquote, safe.
Right.
But they did do a pretty thorough analysis and found that they actually pose lower risks compared to cigarettes and, a lot of those other smokeless tobacco products.
Yeah. And what's interesting is they specifically called out that the ZYN pouches have a lot, like significantly lower amounts of those really harmful things, those constituents that you find in cigarettes. And their data actually shows that a good amount of adults who are smoking cigarettes or using other tobacco products, when they switched over completely to these ZYN pouches, they were able to successfully make that switch.
Wow, that's a pretty strong endorsement, in a way. I mean, obviously the FDA is being careful to say this isn't a blanket statement, but for those people who are already, smokers or tobacco users, it seems like this could potentially be a harm reduction strategy.
Yeah, and they're being very careful, you're right, because they're saying, this authorization doesn't mean that they're suddenly saying that everybody should run out and start using this stuff.
Yeah.
And in fact, they put a lot of restrictions on how the company's even allowed to market the product.
Yeah.
Like they can't do, a bunch of digital advertising, TV, radio, all that stuff. They're being really careful to try and prevent young people from getting exposed to it.
Well, that makes sense, right? It's nicotine. Nicotine is addictive, and so, of course, they would want to do everything they can to keep it out of the hands of kids. I mean, I wonder how this is going to play out long term, though, right? Because this is the first time they've authorized this type of product. Does this open the floodgates for other, alternative nicotine products to start coming on the market?
Yeah, it really is, I think, going to change things. I mean, the landscape of how we deal with, nicotine use and all that, it's going to be fascinating to see how that evolves.
Totally. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. Head south of the border. We're going down to Mexico, and they are making some big changes when it comes to e-commerce and, well, trade in general.
Yeah, a lot of those U.S. companies, they've been using that border skipping strategy, right?
Yeah.
Importing stuff from China, bringing it into Mexico, and then they ship it individually to customers in the U.S.
And they were taking advantage of this, loophole, essentially, where if the shipment's under a certain value, they don't have to pay any duties.
Right, exactly.
So Mexico just said, nope, not anymore.
Yeah, the new president down there, President Sheinbaum, she issued this new decree, and it increases import duties on a ton of stuff. I mean, we're talking about apparel, textiles, a lot of that stuff that's, really commonly shipped this way.
Yeah, and the increases aren't small either. Some of them are jumping from, 25% all the way up to 35%.
Oh, yeah, it's significant. And it gets even more complicated because they're also restricting this program that allowed for temporary, duty-free importation.
So that's another wrench in the system for all these companies that have been relying on these, kind of workarounds.
Right, exactly.
And here's the thing. These changes went into effect, immediately.
Yeah.
There are probably companies right now that have shipments on the way that are suddenly going to be hit with way higher costs than they were expecting.
Oh, yeah. There's definitely a lot of scrambling going on right now, trying to figure out, okay, what do we do? How do we adjust?
This seems like a pretty big power play by Mexico, right? They're really serious about boosting their own domestic textile and apparel industries.
Absolutely. It's about creating jobs in Mexico, building up their own economy. But it's definitely going to have ripple effect on those U.S. e-commerce sellers.
Yeah, they're going to have to think hard about their supply chains, potentially find new places to source their products. And for sure, adjust prices to account for those higher costs.
Yeah, they're going to have to adapt or die, in a way.
It's a whole new ball game now. Speaking of adaptation, our last topic for today, we're going to zoom back up north and talk about the upcoming presidential inauguration.
Ah, yes.
Seems like even presidential inaugurations aren't immune to the forces of, well, in this case, Mother Nature.
Indeed. Some pretty severe cold weather is on the way. They're actually having to make a pretty big change of plans. The whole swearing-in ceremony is being moved indoors.
What? Really?
Yeah, they're moving it to the U.S. Capitol Rotunda.
I mean, I can only imagine the logistical nightmare of having to make that kind of a change at the last minute.
Oh, yeah, it's a massive undertaking. It's actually pretty historic, too. This hasn't happened since Ronald Reagan's second inauguration, way back in 1985.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, it's interesting how something as simple as the weather can just completely throw everything off.
Right, and of course the Rotunda is a lot smaller than the National Mall, right?
Okay, for sure.
So that means a much smaller guest list for the ceremony itself.
Yes.
They're saying it's only going to hold around 700 people.
Wow, that's a far cry from the, 250,000 they were expecting out on the mall.
Oh, yeah. Huge difference.
But at least they've come up with a way to make sure the public can still be part of the whole thing.
Yeah, they're going to be broadcasting the whole ceremony live and the presidential parade at Capital One Arena.
Oh, that's cool. So people can still gather and watch it all happen.
Exactly.
Of course, weather's not the only challenge, right? They've also got to think about security, especially with everything that's been going on lately.
Oh, absolutely. Security is a top priority. They're not taking any chances. I mean, you've got a former president who's going to be attending the inauguration of his successor, which is always a little bit, delicate.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of history there.
And this time around, there's just a heightened sense of concern. So they're really stepping up security measures.
Like, what kind of stuff are they doing?
Well, they're going to have over 25,000 law enforcement officers deployed. We're talking miles of fencing, Coast Guard ships, even helicopters from the Energy Department.
Wow, that's intense.
Yeah, it's a massive operation. They want to make sure that nothing, absolutely nothing, goes wrong.
It really speaks to how important it is to protect that whole process of a peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah, and especially in today's world where there's so much, division and uncertainty, it's really crucial to make sure that this event happens smoothly and safely.
Well, amidst all of this, the linguistical challenges and the security concerns, there's also a really fascinating historical context to this particular inauguration.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's actually pretty unique for a couple of reasons.
Like what?
Well, first of all, it's taking place on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which is pretty rare in itself.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't even realized that.
Yeah, and it's also only the second time in U.S. history that a president is serving non-consecutive terms.
Donald Trump, back in the White House after 4 years out of office. I mean, this is going to be an inauguration for the history books.
It really is. I mean, what does this say about the state of our democracy? What will this second term be like compared to his first? So many questions. Definitely one to watch.
Yeah, so we've got these three seemingly unrelated topics: nicotine pouches, Mexican trade policies, and this inauguration facing all sorts of challenges. But as we're starting to see, there are some pretty big themes that connect them all.
Yeah, you've got regulation, adaptation, this kind of push and pull between global forces and what's happening at a national level.
They all kind of tie together in a way.
Absolutely. And they're not just abstract concepts. I mean, they have real-world implications. We're talking about businesses, individuals, even the future of global politics. There's a lot to unpack here.
There is. It's like all these pieces of a puzzle, and as we go through this deep dive, we're going to start to see how they all fit together.
Exactly. And by the end, you'll have a much clearer understanding of how these seemingly separate events are actually all interconnected and how it affects you, the listener.
And that's what we're all about here, right? Making sense of the complex world we live in.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's dive in.
It's amazing to think about the ripple effect that some of these events can have. Like, we talk about how a seemingly small change, like the weather shifting or, a tweak to a trade policy, it can end up having a way bigger impact than you might initially expect.
Yeah, and I'm curious to explore that a bit further. Like with the FDA authorizing these ZYN pouches,
Right.
what are some of the long-term consequences we might see, stemming from this decision?
Well, for one, I think it could really shake things up in the whole tobacco industry.
How so?
Well, now that the FDA has kind of set this precedent, authorizing this type of product, it's going to open the door for other companies to be like, hey, we want in on this too. So we could see a whole bunch of new alternative nicotine products flooding the market.
And that raises some interesting questions, right?
Definitely.
I mean, on the one hand, it's potentially good for people who are already smokers, right? Maybe these products could help them transition away from traditional cigarettes, which are obviously, way worse for you.
Right. Harm reduction is a big part of the conversation.
But then there's the other side of the coin, right? Like, could this lead to more people, especially young people, getting hooked on nicotine?
Oh, that's a huge concern, and it's going to be a tough one for the FDA to navigate, right?
Okay.
Because they're trying to regulate this industry that's constantly coming up with new ways to, like, deliver nicotine.
Right.
And this decision, it could really change how we as a society, approach nicotine addiction and how we talk about it.
It'll be really interesting to see how consumers react, too. Will they embrace these new products? Will we see a shift away from traditional cigarettes?
Yeah, it's a whole new frontier.
It really is. It makes you wonder if other countries will follow suit. If the U.S. is doing this, will we see similar authorizations popping up around the world?
Yeah, could this start to shift tobacco control policies on a global level? That's a big question.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the ripple effects in terms of, public health and the tobacco industry. But let's shift gears and think about Mexico's new trade policies and how those might reshape the e-commerce landscape.
Well, we already talked about the immediate impact on those companies that were relying on that border skipping strategy.
Right.
Right. They're facing way higher costs now and a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
But in the bigger picture, this move by Mexico, it could actually have a pretty significant impact on, North American trade as a whole.
I mean, it seems like they're drawing a line in the sand, right?
Yep.
They're putting their foot down and saying, we're serious about domestic production. We're serious about job creation in Mexico.
Absolutely. It's a move towards, greater economic independence.
And it's interesting, right? Because this whole idea of reshoring, like bringing manufacturing back to a company's home country, it's been gaining momentum for a while now. And this decision by Mexico, it could really accelerate that trend, especially in these industries like textiles and apparel.
Yeah, it's kind of like a double-edged sword in a way, right?
Oh, so?
Well, on the one hand, you could see job creation, more economic growth in North America.
Right.
But on the other hand, it could also mean higher prices for consumers.
Yeah, that's the trade-off.
Right, exactly. And makes you wonder about these existing trade agreements, like the USMCA. Will we see a shift towards more regionalized economies? Could this lead to countries wanting to renegotiate these agreements to better reflect, these changing priorities? It's a lot to consider.
It's not just about economics either, right?
No, not at all.
These trade policies, they also have political implications, social implications.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, they can impact relationships between countries, migration patterns, even cultural identities. It's all connected.
It's like one seemingly small decision about, how much to tax a certain product.
Right.
And it can set off this chain reaction that touches like every aspect of our lives.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's why it's so important to, stay informed about these things, even if they seem, kind of far removed from our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, because it all comes back around eventually.
It does.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the inauguration. We've already talked about, the logistics of moving the ceremony indoors, the heightened security.
Right.
But I'm curious to explore this idea of small changes having big impacts in this context as well.
Yeah, well, think about that decision to move the ceremony indoors because of the cold. It might seem like, just a logistical thing.
Yeah.
But it actually had some pretty significant implications for, like, the optics of the whole thing, the symbolism.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, traditionally, the inauguration on a national mall.
Right.
It's this grand spectacle, right?
Yeah.
It's this visual representation of, like, a democracy in action, this symbol of unity and strength. Moving it indoors creates a very different atmosphere.
It feels more exclusive, like less accessible to the public.
Exactly. And it also makes you wonder how this will be perceived on the world stage. Right?
Oh, interesting.
Will it be seen as a sign of weakness or vulnerability? Or will people just see it as, a practical response to the weather?
It's hard to say.
And then you've got the heightened security, right?
Yeah.
Which obviously, they need to do everything they can to keep everyone safe.
Of course.
But it also contributes to this sense of unease, maybe even a sense of division.
Yeah, like you're trying to project strength and resilience, but at the same time, you're acknowledging that there are these very real threats.
Right, exactly.
And it's a tough balance to strike. And it makes you realize, like, even something as seemingly simple as changing the venue or, increasing security, it can have a huge impact on how this event is ultimately perceived and how it shapes the narrative of this entire presidency.
Absolutely.
So it's pretty wild, right? We've got these three stories: the FDA and the nicotine pouches, Mexico changing its trade policies, and then this inauguration with all its challenges.
Yeah, and when you really dig in, you start to see those bigger themes, like you said, regulation, adaptation, and this whole, interplay between global forces and what's happening on a national level.
And I think that's one of the things that makes these deep dives so interesting, right? Like, it's not just about the individual stories themselves, but it's about how they connect to these broader trends and forces that are shaping our world.
Right, exactly.
And as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, like, what does all of this mean for our listeners? How can they take these big, complex ideas and actually make them relevant to their own lives?
Well, I think the first thing is just being aware, right? Like, pay attention to the news, read articles, have conversations with people who have different viewpoints. The more informed you are about what's going on, the better equipped you'll be to navigate these changes and make decisions that, align with your values.
It's not just about passively consuming information, though, right?
No, definitely not.
It's about actively engaging with it, thinking critically, and maybe even, like, challenging your own assumptions.
Exactly. Like, take that example with Mexico's trade policies. If you're concerned about how that might affect the price of clothing, maybe you start paying more attention to where the clothes you buy are actually made. Maybe you start looking for brands that produced domestically or explore, alternative sourcing options. It's about being a conscious consumer.
Or if you're, like, really intrigued by this whole debate around alternative nicotine products,
Right.
do your own research. Look into the science, weigh the potential benefits against the risks, and then form your own informed opinion.
And don't underestimate the power of your own voice. Reach out to your elected officials, participate in community discussions, share your thoughts online. We live in a democracy, and it's important that we make our voices heard, especially on issues that matter to us.
It sounds like it's all about being informed, engaged, and proactive.
Absolutely. And that kind of ties back to this idea of adaptation, right?
Right, yeah.
Like, being able to adapt is becoming more and more important in a world that's changing so rapidly. Whether it's learning new skills, embracing new technologies, or just being open to new ideas, being adaptable is key, not just for surviving, but for thriving in this crazy 21st century.
It's about being flexible, being willing to learn and grow, and accepting that, like, change is a constant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Think about those e-commerce companies, the ones that were using that border skipping strategy.
Yeah.
They're having to completely rethink how they do business.
Yeah.
It's a challenge for sure, but it's also an opportunity to come up with new, innovative solutions.
And this whole idea of adaptation, it's not just about, like, businesses or global events, right? It's also about our personal lives.
Oh, absolutely.
We all face unexpected challenges, setbacks, things that force us to change course.
And it's how we respond to those challenges, how we adapt, that really makes all the difference.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's, like, the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember?
Honestly, I just hope they come away with a sense of curiosity and a sense of empowerment. The world is complex, yeah, and it's full of challenges, but it's also full of amazing opportunities to learn, to grow, and to make a real difference. So stay curious, stay informed, and don't be afraid to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and speak up for what you believe in.
I love that. That's a perfect note to end on. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of another deep dive. We hope you enjoyed exploring these topics with us today. And remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and most importantly, keep diving deep.